On my 63rd birthday, my daughter Rebecca looked me straight in the eyes and said, "You're nothing but a burden, Dad." I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because after 35 years of sacrifice, I finally understood that everything I thought I knew about family was a lie. Before I tell you what happened next, and trust me, you won't see this coming, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Because what I'm about to share isn't just my story. It's a warning. And if you've ever felt unappreciated by the people you love most, you need to hear this. Hit that subscribe button too, because this story gets darker than you think, and you won't want to miss how it ends. My name is Thomas Brennan, and I spent my entire adult life believing that being a good father meant putting everyone else first. I was wrong. Dead wrong. And it took my own daughter's cruelty to wake me up to a truth that would change everything. The morning started like any other birthday in the past decade, quietly. My wife Margaret had been gone for 8 years, cancer taking her piece by piece until there was nothing left but memories and medical bills. Since then, birthdays had become just another Tuesday, another Thursday, another day that reminded me how alone I'd become despite having 3 children who lived within 20 miles of me. I was in my kitchen, making coffee in the same chipped mug Margaret bought me 15 years ago, when Rebecca walked in without knocking. She'd been doing that more often lately, treating my house like it was hers to command. At 42, she carried herself with the kind of entitled confidence that comes from never hearing the word no when it mattered. She didn't say happy birthday. Didn't acknowledge the date at all. Instead, she dropped a manila envelope on my kitchen table with the kind of authority that made my stomach clench. "We need to talk, Dad." I set down my coffee and looked at the envelope. Official letterhead peeked through the manila paper. My hands were steadier than they should have been, considering what was coming. Maybe some part of me had been expecting this moment for years. "What's this about, Rebecca?" She pulled out a chair and sat down across from me like she was conducting a business meeting. Her perfectly styled blonde hair, her expensive handbag, her manicured nails, everything about her screamed success. Everything except her eyes, which had gone cold in a way that reminded me of her mother during the worst fights we'd ever had. "It's about facing reality," she said, sliding the envelope closer to me. "You can't live alone anymore. You're forgetting things. The neighbors called me last week because you left your garden hose running for 6 hours. Mrs. Chin said you looked confused when she asked you about it." I remembered that day perfectly. I'd been watering Margaret's rose bushes, the ones I'd kept alive for 8 years as a promise to her memory. I'd gotten lost in thought, remembering how she used to hum while she gardened, how she'd wear my old work shirts that hung down to her knees. The hose had been running, yes, but I hadn't been confused. I'd been grieving. There's a difference, though I'd learned not to explain that to my children anymore. "I was thinking about your mother," I said quietly. Rebecca's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. "That's exactly what I mean. You're living in the past, Dad. It's not healthy. It's not fair to us either." Us. As if she and her brothers David and Michael had been consulted. As if this was a family decision made with love and concern instead of what it really was, convenience wrapped in fake worry. I opened the envelope with the careful movements of a man who'd spent 40 years working construction, who'd learned that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes led to injuries. Inside were brochures for assisted living facilities. Glossy photos of smiling elderly people playing checkers and doing watercolor paintings. Places where people went to wait for death while pretending to live. "You've been researching this," I said. "We all have." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "David thinks Sunset Manor would be perfect for you. It's only 15 minutes from his house, and they have a great activities program. Michael found one closer to him in Portland, but I think staying local makes more sense." The casual way she discussed dismantling my life made something cold settle in my chest. These weren't suggestions. This was a presentation. A decision that had already been made, dressed up as a conversation to make her feel better about it. "And what do you think, Rebecca?" For the first time, her composure cracked slightly. She looked around my kitchen, at the photos of her and her brothers on the refrigerator, at the small dining table where I'd helped her with homework for 12 years, at the window over the sink where Margaret used to stand and watch her play in the backyard. "I think you're being selfish," she said finally. "You're making us worry constantly. Every time the phone rings, we wonder if something's happened to you. Do you know what that's like? Do you know how exhausting it is to be responsible for a parent who won't admit they need help?" The word selfish hit me like a physical blow. In 35 years of raising her, through dance recitals and soccer games and teenage heartbreak and college tuition I couldn't afford, I'd never once been called selfish by my daughter. But here she was, on my birthday, rewriting our entire history with one word. "I never asked you to be responsible for me," I said. "You don't have to ask." Her voice rose, and for a moment she sounded like the little girl who used to cry when she scraped her knee, who used to run to me for comfort. "It just happens when your parent gets old and stubborn and refuses to face reality." I stood up slowly, my knees protesting the movement. 63 wasn't ancient, but decades of physical labor had left their mark. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at Margaret's garden, at the roses that were just starting to bloom despite my imperfect care. What reality am I refusing to face, exactly? She was quiet for so long I thought she might have left. When I turned around, she was staring at the brochures spread across my table, her jaw set in determination. "That we're tired, Dad. We're tired of worrying about you. We're tired of checking on you. We're tired of feeling guilty when we don't call enough or visit enough or do enough. We have our own families, our own problems, our own lives. And you're—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully, then decided not to. "You're nothing but a burden." The silence that followed was complete. Even the old house seemed to hold its breath. I could hear the refrigerator humming, the clock on the wall ticking, the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. But I couldn't hear any love in her words. Any regret. Any recognition of what she just said to the man who'd raised her. I laughed. It started as a small chuckle and grew into something deeper, something that came from a place I'd forgotten existed. Not because it was funny. There was nothing funny about watching your child reveal how little you mean to them. I laughed because after years of wondering why my children felt so distant, why their visits felt obligatory, why their calls felt rushed, I finally had my answer. I was a burden. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Dad, I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." I turned to face her fully, and something in my expression made her stop talking. "You meant every word of it. And you know what? You're absolutely right." She blinked, clearly expecting me to fight back, to argue, to defend myself. Instead, I walked back to the table and gathered up the brochures, stacking them neatly. "I have been a burden," I continued, my voice steady and calm. "I've been the kind of father who expected his children to care about him just because he cared about them. I've been the kind of man who thought that 35 years of sacrifice meant something. That staying up all night when you had pneumonia when you were 8 might count for something. That working double shifts for 3 years to pay for your wedding might matter. But you're right, that's all in the past, isn't it?" Rebecca's face had gone pale. "Dad, stop." "Stop what? Agreeing with you?" I smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant smile. "You've made your position very clear. You and your brothers have discussed this, researched it, planned it all out. You've decided what's best for me without including me in the conversation. And you're tired of the burden of having a father who's still alive and still inconvenient." I stood up and walked to the kitchen drawer where I kept important papers. Birth certificates, insurance documents, Margaret's death certificate, the paperwork of a life lived. And there, beneath everything else, something I'd forgotten about until this moment. Something that would change everything. "There's just one thing you might not have considered in your planning," I said, pulling out the document I was looking for. "One little detail that might complicate your neat, tidy solution to the burden problem." Rebecca leaned forward despite herself. "What are you talking about?" I set the paper on the table between us. It was old, yellowed at the edges, but the ink was still clear. Still legally binding. Still exactly what I remembered it to be. "Your mother's will." I said quietly. The one that left everything to me, with very specific instructions about what should happen to it. Rebecca grabbed the document, her eyes scanning the familiar legal language. I watched her face as she found the clause that mattered, the one Margaret and I had discussed on one of her last good days, when the cancer hadn't yet stolen her ability to think clearly. Her hands were shaking by the time she finished reading. "This can't be right," she whispered. "It's right," I said. "Every word of it. Your mother was very specific about her wishes. And very specific about the conditions that had to be met. I won't tell you what that document said just yet. But I will tell you this, it was about to turn my children's convenient little plan upside down. And for the first time in years, I was going to stop being the burden they thought I was and become something else entirely. Something they never saw coming. The color drained from Rebecca's face as she read Margaret's will for the second time, her finger tracing the words as if she could make them disappear through sheer force of denial. What she was seeing would shatter everything she thought she knew about our family's future. But before I tell you what my wife had hidden in that document, and why it would soon turn my children's world completely upside down, I need you to understand something. If you've ever felt taken for granted by your own family, if you've ever wondered if the people you sacrificed for even notice your sacrifices, then what happens next is going to hit you right in the gut. Make sure you're subscribed, because this story is about to take a turn that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about family loyalty. Margaret had always been smarter than me. In 37 years of marriage, she'd been the planner, the organizer, the one who thought 5 moves ahead while I was still figuring out the first one. But I'd never realized just how far ahead she'd been thinking until that moment, watching my daughter's face crumble as she processed what she was reading. "Dad, this has to be a mistake," Rebecca stammered, looking up from the document with something close to panic in her eyes. "Mom would never have." "Your mother would never have what?" I asked, settling back into my chair with the patience of a man who suddenly had all the time in the world. "Protected herself? Protected me? Made sure that the people who claimed to love her would have to prove it?" The document Rebecca held contained Margaret's final wishes, written during the last months of her life when the treatments weren't working and we both knew time was running out. Most of it was standard, funeral arrangements, personal belongings, the kind of practical details that grieving families need spelled out clearly. But buried in the middle, in language I'd helped her craft with our lawyer, was a clause that my children had never bothered to ask about. The house, the land, the savings account that had grown slowly over 4 decades of careful living, everything was mine, as expected. But there was a condition. A very specific condition that Margaret had insisted on after watching how our children had started treating me even before she died. "She was sick when she wrote this," Rebecca said, her voice getting higher. "The cancer, the medications, she wasn't thinking clearly." I shook my head slowly. "She was thinking more clearly than any of us. Your mother saw something coming that I was too blind to notice. She saw how you and your brothers were already pulling away from us. How visits became shorter. How calls became less frequent. How we went from being your parents to being your obligation." Margaret had been devastated by it, though she tried to hide her hurt from me. I'd find her sometimes in the evenings, staring at photos of the kids when they were young, tears running down her cheeks. When I'd ask her what was wrong, she'd just smile and say she was being silly. But she wasn't being silly. She was watching her children grow into strangers. "Mom loved us," Rebecca insisted. "She wouldn't have put conditions on her love." "She didn't put conditions on her love," I replied. "She put conditions on her money. There's a difference, though I'm starting to think you wouldn't understand it." The truth was devastating in its simplicity. Margaret had watched our children become successful adults who were too busy for their parents. She'd seen the way they'd check their phones during dinner, the way they'd glance at their watches during conversations, the way they'd find excuses to cut visits short. And she'd made a decision. If they wanted to inherit anything, and with the house alone worth nearly $500,000, plus Margaret's life insurance and our combined savings, we were talking about a substantial amount, they would have to prove they deserved it. Not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations of love, but through something much simpler and much harder. Time. The condition is clear, I said, tapping the document. Any beneficiary who places me in an assisted living facility or nursing home forfeits their entire inheritance. Any beneficiary who fails to maintain regular, meaningful contact with me forfeits their inheritance. Any beneficiary who treats me as a burden rather than as family forfeits their inheritance. Rebecca's hands were shaking now. That's not legal. You can't just. Mom can't control us from the grave. She's not controlling you, I said calmly. She's giving you a choice. You can treat me like family and inherit what she left for you, or you can treat me like a burden and get nothing. Your choice entirely. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of years of accumulated disappointment. I could see Rebecca's mind racing, trying to find some loophole, some way around what Margaret had done. But my wife had been thorough. She'd consulted lawyers, researched precedents, made sure every word would hold up in court. How much are we talking about? Rebecca asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The question revealed everything I needed to know about where her priorities lay. Not, how could Mom do this to us? Or, what did she want from us? But, how much money are we talking about? Between the house, the life insurance, the savings, and the investments your mother made over the years, I said slowly, roughly $1.2 million. Split 3 ways if all 3 of you meet the conditions. Rebecca's face went white. A third of $1.2 million was enough to pay off her mortgage, put her kids through college, maybe even let her and her husband retire early. It was life-changing money. It was also money that would disappear the moment she signed me into one of those glossy assisted living facilities. The others, she said suddenly. David and Michael. Do they know? They know about the will. They don't know about the conversation we're having right now. They don't know that their sister just called their father a burden on his birthday and tried to convince him to sign his life away. I watched the calculation happen in her eyes. If she told her brothers what she'd said, they'd know she was in danger of losing her inheritance. If she didn't tell them, she'd have to find some way to backtrack, to undo the damage she'd done with words that couldn't be unsaid. Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't mean. Stop. The word came out harder than I'd intended, but I was tired of her lies. Don't you dare stand in my kitchen on my birthday and apologize for telling me the truth. You meant every word you said, and we both know it. The only thing you're sorry about is that it's going to cost you. Rebecca slumped back in her chair, looking suddenly older than her 42 years. What do you want from me? It was the wrong question, asked 20 years too late. What I wanted was the daughter who used to curl up with me on Sunday mornings to watch cartoons. What I wanted was the little girl who used to beg me to read just one more bedtime story. What I wanted was a child who loved me for something other than what I could give her. But what I wanted and what I could have were 2 different things. I don't want anything from you, Rebecca. Your mother's will makes that clear. If you want something from me, specifically, if you want to inherit what your mother worked her whole life to save, then you'll figure out what you're willing to do to earn it. She stood up abruptly, grabbing her purse with jerky, angry movements. This is manipulation. This is emotional blackmail. No, I said, standing up as well. This is consequences. This is what happens when you spend years treating someone like they don't matter and then discover that they do. Your mother knew exactly what kind of adults you'd all become, and she planned accordingly. Rebecca stopped at the kitchen door, her hand on the handle. For a moment, I thought she might turn around, might try to salvage something from the wreckage of our conversation. Instead, she looked back at me with an expression I'd never seen before, cold calculation mixed with something that might have been hatred. You think you're so clever, she said. You think you've won something. But all you've done is guarantee that we'll resent you for the rest of your life. Every phone call, every visit, every conversation we have from now on will be about money. Is that really what you want? The honesty of her words was like a slap, but also strangely liberating. At least now we both knew where we stood. Better than being a burden, I said quietly. She left without saying goodbye, the kitchen door slamming behind her hard enough to rattle the windows. I stood there for a long time afterward, listening to her car start up and drive away, listening to the silence that followed. Then I walked to the window and looked out at Margaret's roses, blooming despite everything. My phone rang exactly 43 minutes later. David's name appeared on the screen, which meant Rebecca had wasted no time in calling her brothers. I let it ring 4 times before answering, just to make sure my voice would be steady. "Hi, son. Dad, what the hell is going on?" David's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Rebecca just called me crying, something about Mom's will and you losing your mind. What did you say to her?" I smiled, though he couldn't see it. The second part of Margaret's plan was about to begin, and my children had no idea what they were walking into. "I told her the truth," I said. "And now I'm going to tell you the truth too. Come over tonight, David. Bring Michael. It's time we all had a family meeting." "Dad, if this is about money..." "It's about a lot more than money," I interrupted. "But money's part of it. A big part of it. And if you want to know how big, you'll be here at 7 o'clock. I hung up before he could respond, then walked to Margaret's desk in the living room where she'd kept all her important papers. There were more documents there, more pieces of her plan that my children hadn't seen yet. More surprises that would change everything they thought they knew about their inheritance, and their father. Because Margaret hadn't just protected our assets. She'd given me something much more valuable than money. She'd given me power. The power to make my children choose between their convenience and their inheritance. The power to find out, once and for all, which one mattered more to them. Tonight they were going to learn that the burden they'd been trying to get rid of was about to become the most important person in their lives. Whether they liked it or not. By 6:30 that evening, I'd made coffee, set out Margaret's good china, the set she'd only used for holidays, and arranged 3 copies of the will on my dining room table. The house felt different somehow, charged with the kind of electricity that comes before a storm. I'd been dreading this conversation for years, but now that it was here, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: anticipation. If you've ever been in a position where you had to prove your worth to people who should have valued you all along, you know the feeling I'm talking about. That mixture of dread and excitement, knowing that everything is about to change and you're the one holding all the cards. Stay with me, because what happened in that dining room that night would reshape my family forever, and not in the way my children expected. David arrived first, exactly at 7, because punctuality had always been his religion. At 45, he carried himself like the successful insurance executive he'd become, all pressed shirts and calculated gestures. But his eyes were worried, darting around the dining room as if he expected to find evidence of some mental breakdown that would explain away what Rebecca had told him. "Dad, you look tired," he said, which was his way of asking if I was losing my mind without actually asking the question. "I feel better than I have in years," I replied honestly. Michael showed up 10 minutes later, bringing with him the familiar scent of expensive cologne and the subtle arrogance that had served him well as a corporate lawyer. At 39, he was the youngest of my 3 children and had always been the most direct. Where Rebecca manipulated and David calculated, Michael simply demanded. "All right, Dad, what's this about?" he said before he'd even sat down. Rebecca was practically hysterical on the phone. "Something about Mom's will having secret conditions?" I gestured to the chairs around the table. "Sit down. Both of you. There are some things about your mother's final wishes that we need to discuss." They exchanged glances, that wordless communication between siblings that had always excluded me, even when they were children. David took his seat carefully, while Michael dropped into his chair with the dramatic sigh of a busy man forced to waste his evening on family nonsense. "Where's Rebecca?" David asked. "She'll join us when she's ready," I said. "What we discuss tonight affects all of you equally, so it doesn't matter if she's here for the first conversation or not." I picked up one of the copies of the will and handed it to David, then gave the second copy to Michael. They began reading immediately, their expressions shifting from annoyance to confusion to something approaching alarm as they reached the clauses Margaret had insisted on including. The silence stretched for nearly 10 minutes while they processed what they were seeing. I used the time to study their faces, to watch the exact moment when each of them realized that everything they'd assumed about their inheritance was wrong. David finished first, his insurance background having taught him to read legal documents quickly. He set the papers down with the careful movements of a man trying not to reveal how shaken he was. "This can't be right," he said quietly. "Mom wouldn't have done this." Michael was still reading, his lawyer's training making him more thorough. When he finally looked up, his face was flushed with anger. "This is insane. You can't put conditions like this on an inheritance. It's coercive. It's probably illegal." "It's completely legal," I said calmly. "Your mother consulted with 3 different attorneys before having this drawn up. Every word of it will hold up in court." "But why?" David's voice cracked slightly. "Why would she do this to us?" I leaned back in my chair, remembering the night Margaret and I had discussed this very question. She'd been weak from chemotherapy, but her mind had been crystal clear. She'd wanted to protect me, yes, but more than that, she'd wanted to protect the memory of what our family used to be. "Because she was dying," I said simply. "And dying people see things differently than the rest of us. They see what really matters. They see through the pretenses and the excuses and the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about family." Michael slammed his hand on the table. "That's not an answer. That's philosophical bullshit." "Is it?" I asked. "Then let me give you a more direct answer. She did it because she watched the 3 of you turn into strangers. She did it because she saw how you treated us in her final months. Like an obligation, like a burden, like something to be managed rather than loved." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Because that's exactly what they were. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Dad, that's not fair. We were there for Mom. We visited, we helped with doctor appointments. You showed up," I interrupted. "There's a difference between showing up and being present. Your mother knew the difference, even if you didn't." I stood up and walked to the china cabinet where Margaret had kept our family photos. 30 years of Christmas mornings, birthday parties, graduations, and weddings. I pulled out one particular photo, Thanksgiving 4 years ago, the last one Margaret had been strong enough to cook for. "Look at this," I said, setting the photo on the table. "Really look at it." In the photo, Margaret was smiling at the camera, but her eyes were tired. She'd spent 2 days cooking for a family dinner that lasted less than 3 hours because Rebecca had to get back home for some soccer practice. David had a conference call he couldn't miss, and Michael had a date. I remembered helping her clean up afterward, remembered how she'd cried while washing dishes, though she'd insisted it was just the steam making her eyes water. "She cooked for 3 days," I said. "She made all your favorite dishes, even though the chemo made food smell terrible to her. She set the table with her grandmother's china, the same china you're sitting at now. And you couldn't wait to leave." Michael's jaw tightened. "We had obligations. You had choices." I cut him off. "And you chose everything else over her. Just like you've chosen everything else over me since she died." The truth was settling over them now, heavy and uncomfortable. I could see them remembering things they'd forgotten or chosen to ignore. The shortened phone calls, the excuses for missing visits, the way they'd started treating our family gatherings like business meetings to be endured rather than celebrated. "So what happens now?" David asked quietly. "What exactly does this will require from us?" I sat back down and picked up my own copy of the document. "It's actually quite simple. You want your inheritance? You treat me like family, not like a burden. You maintain regular, meaningful contact. You don't try to warehouse me in some facility so you can forget about me." "Define regular," Michael said, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Define meaningful." I smiled at that. "Your mother was very specific. Each of you must have substantial contact with me at least twice per week. Phone calls that last more than 5 minutes count. Visits that last more than an hour count. Family dinners count double. Michael was taking notes now, treating this like a business negotiation. And what happens if we don't meet these requirements? Then you forfeit your inheritance entirely. Your portion gets donated to charity. Which charity? David asked. The one your mother chose. The hospice center where she spent her final weeks. She thought they deserved the money more than children who couldn't be bothered to spend time with their dying mother. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. This wasn't confusion or shock anymore. This was calculation. I could practically hear the wheels turning in their heads, trying to figure out the cost-benefit analysis of pretending to love their father. There's more, I continued, because Margaret had been thorough in her planning. The conditions don't just apply to your inheritance. They apply to mine as well. What do you mean? David asked. I mean that I can't give you your inheritance even if I wanted to. The will establishes a trust, managed by an independent trustee. They monitor compliance with the conditions. They determine whether each of you has met the requirements. I have no say in it. Michael's face went pale. Who's the trustee? James Morrison. Your mother's cousin. The one who's been a family court judge for the past 20 years. The one who watched you kids grow up and remembers what you used to be like before you became who you are now. I had to give Margaret credit. She'd chosen her trustee perfectly. Judge Morrison was incorruptible, had no patience for manipulation, and knew our family well enough to spot any attempts at fake compliance. He'd also lost his own parents to neglect by adult children too busy for family, which gave him very strong opinions about the kind of behavior Margaret was trying to prevent. This is impossible. Rebecca's voice came from the doorway. I turned to see her standing there, having let herself in again. Her eyes were red from crying, but her jaw was set with determination. We can't just reorganize our entire lives around visiting Dad twice a week. Why not? I asked. I reorganized my entire life around raising you. For 18 years, my schedule revolved around your needs, your activities, your problems. Your mother did the same thing. We made you the center of our universe for decades. Is it really so unreasonable to ask for 2 visits a week now that I'm old and alone? Rebecca moved into the room and took the 4th chair, the one that had been Margaret's. It's not about reasonable. It's about practical. I have my own family, my own responsibilities. And I had my own dreams. I interrupted. I had plans and ambitions and things I wanted to do with my life. But I put them aside because you needed me to. Because that's what parents do for their children. The question is, what do children do for their parents? The room fell silent again. 3 successful adults, all of them smart enough to understand what was happening, all of them trying to find some way to twist this situation to their advantage. But Margaret had been smarter than all of us. She'd created a scenario where they couldn't manipulate me, couldn't guilt me, couldn't find some clever legal loophole to escape. They could choose to be a family, or they could choose to walk away. But they couldn't have both. How long do we have to decide? Michael asked finally. You don't, I said. The conditions start immediately. If you want your inheritance, you start earning it tonight. If you don't, then this is probably the last time we'll all be in the same room together. I stood up and began clearing the china from the table, each piece carefully placed back in the cabinet where Margaret had kept them. My children sat in stunned silence, watching me move around the dining room where we'd shared so many meals when they were young, where Margaret had helped them with homework and listened to their problems and made them feel like they were the most important people in the world. There's one more thing, I said, turning back to face them. Your mother left each of you a letter. Personal letters, written in her final weeks. They're sealed, and according to the will, you only get to read them if you successfully meet the conditions for 1 full year. Rebecca's breath caught. What do they say? I don't know. She wrote them alone, sealed them herself, gave them to Judge Morrison. But knowing your mother, I'd guess they contain the words she never got to say to you. The things she wanted you to understand about family, about love, about the kind of people she hoped you'd become. I walked to the front door and opened it, a clear signal that our meeting was over. You have a choice to make, I said. All of you. You can choose to see this as manipulation, as some cruel game your mother and I are playing from beyond the grave. Or you can choose to see it as an opportunity, a chance to discover if there's still a family somewhere beneath all the resentment and obligation. One by one, they filed past me toward the door. David paused, looking like he wanted to say something, then thought better of it. Michael brushed past without making eye contact. Rebecca stopped directly in front of me. I hate you for this, she whispered. I know, I said. But for the first time in years, you're being honest with me. That's progress. After they left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the photos and memories of a life spent raising children who'd grown into strangers. But something had shifted tonight. Something important. For the first time since Margaret's death, I wasn't the one begging for attention, for time, for love. They were going to have to decide what I was worth to them. And whatever they decided, I'd finally know where I stood. The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. David's name on the caller ID. I smiled and let it ring twice before answering. Hi, son. Dad? His voice was careful, measured. I was thinking, would you like to have lunch tomorrow? Just the two of us. We could go to that diner you like. I'd like that very much, I said. 1 down. 2 to go. David picked me up at noon the next day in his pristine black sedan, the kind of car that screamed successful insurance executive to anyone who saw it. He was wearing a casual shirt instead of his usual business attire, which felt like a small concession to the new reality we both found ourselves in. But his hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, and he kept glancing at me like he expected me to disappear or suddenly announce this was all some elaborate joke. The silence stretched between us as we drove toward Murphy's Diner, the same place I'd taken him for breakfast every Saturday morning when he was 12 and going through his parents are embarrassing phase. Back then, he'd order chocolate chip pancakes and tell me about his week, the kids at school, the teachers he liked, the girl he had a crush on but was too shy to talk to. Now he was 45, successful beyond anything I'd ever dreamed for him, and we couldn't find enough words to fill a 10-minute car ride. If you've ever tried to rebuild a relationship that's been damaged by years of neglect and resentment, you know how fragile those first attempts feel. Every word matters. Every gesture gets analyzed. Every silence feels loaded with the weight of everything that went wrong before. And that's exactly where David and I found ourselves. Two strangers who happened to share DNA, trying to figure out if there was anything left worth saving. Murphy's Diner hadn't changed in 30 years. Same red vinyl booths, same black and white checkered floor, same smell of bacon grease and coffee that had soaked into the walls over decades of serving comfort food to people who needed it. The waitress, a woman named Linda who'd been working there since David was in high school, recognized us both immediately. Well, look what the cat dragged in, she said with a smile that felt genuine. Haven't seen you two together in years. The usual? David looked confused for a moment, then surprised. You remember what I used to order? Linda laughed. Honey, I remember what you ordered when you were 12. Chocolate chip pancakes, extra syrup, orange juice, and a side of bacon burned crispy. Your dad always got the Denver omelet, wheat toast, and coffee black as motor oil. I'll have the pancakes, David said softly. And orange juice. It was such a small thing, but something about hearing him order his childhood favorite made my chest tight. For just a moment, he looked like the boy who used to bounce in these same booths, sticky with syrup and full of stories about his adventures. We sat across from each other in uncomfortable silence until Linda brought our coffee. David wrapped his hands around the mug like it was an anchor, staring down into the dark liquid as if it might hold answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. So, he said finally, how long have you known? About Mom's will, I mean. Since the day she died, I replied honestly. She made me promise not to tell you kids unless it became necessary. She hoped it would never come to that. He looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw something other than obligation in his eyes. She really thought we'd abandoned you? The question was loaded with hurt and defensive anger, but also something else, genuine confusion. As if the idea that his behavior might have seemed like abandonment had never occurred to him. She thought you already had, I said gently. And honestly, son, so did I. David's face flushed. That's not fair, Dad. We visited. We called. When was the last time you called me just to talk? I interrupted. Not because you needed something, not because you felt obligated, not because it was a holiday or birthday. When was the last time you called me because you wanted to hear my voice? The silence that followed was answer enough. David stared down at his coffee, his jaw working like he was chewing words he couldn't quite bring himself to spit out. I've been busy, he said finally. Work is demanding, the kids have activities, Sarah's been dealing with her mother's health issues. I'm not judging you for being busy, I said. I'm just answering your question. Your mother saw a pattern, and she was worried about what would happen to me when she was gone. Turns out she was right to worry. Linda appeared with our food, setting David's pancakes in front of him with a flourish. Just like when you were little, she said warmly. Though you're gonna have to eat more than pancakes if you want to keep up with those kids of yours. After she left, David picked up his fork but didn't start eating. Instead, he looked around the diner, his eyes taking in details he'd probably forgotten. I used to love coming here with you, he said quietly. You used to tell me everything, I replied. About school, about your friends, about the girl you had a crush on, Jenny Morrison, wasn't it? Judge Morrison's daughter. A small smile crossed David's face. You remember that? I remember everything about those Saturday mornings, I said. They were the best part of my week. 2 hours where it was just you and me, and you actually wanted to be with your old man. David took a bite of his pancakes, chewing slowly like he was tasting something from a dream. When did that change? It was the right question, but I wasn't sure he was ready for the real answer. The truth was that it had changed gradually, so slowly that neither of us noticed it happening until it was already done. High school had brought different priorities. College had created physical distance. His career and marriage had filled his time with new responsibilities. And somewhere along the way, our Saturday morning breakfasts had become monthly dinners, then holiday visits, then phone calls that felt more like status updates than conversations. I think it changed when you stopped needing me, I said finally. And maybe that's natural. Maybe that's how it's supposed to work. Kids grow up, move away, build their own lives. The problem is, nobody tells you how to handle being the parent who's left behind. David set down his fork, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears. I never meant to make you feel abandoned. I know you didn't. That's what makes it so hard. If you'd been cruel or deliberately hurtful, I could have been angry. But you were just absent. Living your life, taking care of your family, being successful. All the things I raised you to do. How could I be angry about that? But Mom was angry, David said. I shook my head. Your mother wasn't angry. She was heartbroken. There's a difference. Angry parents fight back, make demands, cause scenes. Heartbroken parents just fade away. They learn to expect less, to need less, to be less. And that's what your mother saw happening to both of us. David pushed his pancakes around his plate, the childhood comfort food suddenly seeming too heavy. So what now? I mean, I'm here. We're having lunch. Does this count toward the will requirements? The question revealed everything I needed to know about where his head was. This wasn't about rebuilding our relationship, it was about managing his inheritance. I felt the familiar sting of disappointment, but also something else. Relief, maybe? At least now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. It counts, I said. But David, if this is just about the money, then you should know something. That $1.2 million? Your mother and I could have spent it traveling, enjoying our retirement, living in comfort. Instead, we saved it for you kids because we thought it would make your lives better. We thought it was a gift of love. I pulled out my wallet and placed a $20 bill on the table, enough to cover both our meals and Linda's tip. But if love is what we were trying to give you, and money is what you're trying to get from us, Then we failed somewhere along the way. I stood up to leave, but David's voice stopped me. Dad, wait. I turned back to see him staring at his half-eaten pancakes, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be a son to you anymore. It's been so long since we were close, I don't even remember what that felt like. The honesty in his voice was like a crack in a dam. Not enough to break it, but enough to let something through. Something that might eventually grow into something bigger. I sat back down. Do you remember what you used to tell me about school? About the kids who picked on you because you were small for your age? David nodded. Tommy Kellerman and his friends. They used to corner me by the bike racks after school. And what did I tell you to do about it? You said to stand up to them. That bullies only pick on people who won't fight back. And did you? A small smile played at the corners of David's mouth. I punched Tommy in the nose. Got suspended for 3 days, but he never bothered me again. Your mother was furious with me for that advice, I said. She thought I was teaching you to solve problems with violence. But I wasn't teaching you to be violent. I was teaching you to stand up for yourself, to decide what you were worth and demand that other people respect it. David looked up at me, understanding starting to dawn in his eyes. And that's what you're doing now. With the will, with the conditions. You're standing up to us. I'm deciding what I'm worth, I said. And demanding that my children respect it. Your mother gave me the tools to do it, but the choice to use them was mine. We sat in silence for a moment, the diner humming with the quiet conversations of other families, other fathers and sons who might or might not understand how precious and fragile these moments really were. I want to try, David said finally. Not just for the money, though I'll be honest, that's part of it. But I want to try to remember what it felt like to want to be with my dad. Then you'll need to answer one question, I said. And I need you to be completely honest with me, even if the answer hurts. What question? Do you love me, David? Not as an obligation, not as a memory of who I used to be to you, but as I am now. Do you love the 73-year-old man sitting across from you, or do you just feel guilty about not loving him? The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of truth that neither of us had been brave enough to speak before. David stared at me, and I could see him wrestling with an answer that would change everything, no matter what it was. I don't know, he whispered finally. I honestly don't know. But I want to find out. It wasn't the answer I'd hoped for, but it was honest. And after years of polite lies and comfortable pretenses, honesty felt like a gift. Then let's find out together, I said. Linda brought us the check, but David had already pulled out his wallet. Let me get this, Dad. It's the least I can do. As we walked to his car, he surprised me by asking, Same time next week? I'd like that, I said. But David? Next time, don't come because you have to. Come because you want to. He nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The truth was, neither of us knew if he'd ever want to come or if this was just the beginning of an elaborate performance designed to secure his inheritance. But at least now we were both willing to find out. On the drive home, my phone buzzed with a text message. Michael's name appeared on the screen. Can we talk tonight? I'll come by around 8. 2 down, I thought. 1 to go. But as David's car pulled away from my house, I realized something important. This wasn't really about the money, despite what my children thought. This was about something much more valuable and much more dangerous. This was about finding out if love could be rebuilt from the ashes of disappointment. And whether any of us were brave enough to try. Michael arrived at exactly 8 o'clock that evening, which was both typical and telling. As a corporate lawyer, he lived his life in billable hours and scheduled meetings, approaching even family conversations like business transactions. But tonight something was different about him. His usual confidence seemed forced, and there were lines of stress around his eyes that I'd never noticed before. He was carrying a briefcase, which should have been my first warning sign. Before I tell you what my youngest son had planned, and how spectacularly it would backfire, let me remind you of something. If you're watching this story unfold and thinking about your own family relationships, pay attention to what happens next. Because sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones most capable of surprising us. And not always in good ways. "Dad," Michael said as he stepped into my living room, his eyes already scanning the space like he was cataloging assets. "We need to discuss this situation rationally." I gestured to Margaret's favorite armchair, but he remained standing, briefcase in hand like he was preparing for a hostile takeover rather than a conversation with his father. "I've been thinking about Mom's will," he continued, "and I believe there might be some legal remedies available to us. Remedies that could benefit everyone involved." The word remedies made my blood run cold. When lawyers started talking about remedies, it usually meant someone was about to get screwed. "What kind of remedies?" I asked, settling into my own chair with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to be suspicious of his own children. Michael opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I've consulted with some colleagues who specialize in estate law. There are several grounds on which we could contest Mom's will. Diminished capacity due to her illness, undue influence, unconscionable conditions, any number of approaches that could invalidate the more restrictive clauses." I stared at him, trying to process what I was hearing. My youngest son, the boy I'd put through law school by working double shifts for 4 years, was standing in my living room proposing to destroy his dying mother's final wishes. "You want to contest your mother's will?" I said slowly. "I want to protect this family from manipulation," he replied smoothly. "Dad, you have to understand, what Mom did wasn't legal guardianship or normal inheritance planning. It was emotional coercion designed to force artificial relationships. No court would uphold conditions this invasive if properly challenged." The clinical language he was using, artificial relationships, emotional coercion, revealed everything I needed to know about how he saw our family. We weren't people to him anymore. We were legal problems to be solved. "Your mother was dying, Michael. She was trying to protect me. She was trying to control us." He shot back, his lawyer's mask slipping to reveal something uglier beneath. "And you're letting her do it from the grave." I stood up slowly, my joints protesting the movement. "Show me what you've got." Michael's eyes lit up with professional excitement. He spread papers across my coffee table, transforming my living room into a makeshift law office. Legal briefs, case precedents, medical records from Margaret's final months. He'd been thorough in his research. "This is the key," he said, pointing to a thick document. "Mom's medical records show she was on significant pain medication during the last 6 months of her life. Opiates, anti-anxiety medications, drugs that could have impaired her judgment when she made changes to the will." I picked up the medical record, seeing Margaret's final months reduced to a series of prescriptions and dosages. "She was in pain, Michael. Of course she was on medication. Pain medication that can cause confusion, hallucinations, impaired decision-making." He pressed on. "Any estate attorney worth their salt could argue that her mental state was compromised when she added those coercive clauses." The word coercive hit me like a physical blow. Margaret had spent her final weeks worrying about me, trying to ensure I wouldn't be abandoned by the children we'd sacrificed everything to raise. And her youngest son was calling that love coercive. "What about the lawyers she consulted?" I asked. "The multiple attorneys who helped her draft this will?" Michael waved dismissively. "Elder law attorneys who specialize in these kinds of emotional manipulation tactics. Their consultations actually support our case. They showed this was premeditated coercion, not spontaneous decision-making." I sat back down, the papers spread before me like evidence of my family's complete moral collapse. "And what happens if you succeed? What happens if you contest the will and win?" "The inheritance gets distributed according to the original will Mom wrote 15 years ago," Michael said. "Equal thirds, no conditions, no manipulation. Clean and simple." "And what happens to me?" For the first time, Michael hesitated. It was a small pause, barely noticeable, but it told me everything. He'd thought through the legal strategy, the financial implications, the procedural requirements. He'd just forgotten to consider the human being at the center of it all. You'd still be taken care of, he said finally. We'd make sure you had everything you needed. In an assisted living facility. In appropriate care, yes. The kind of appropriate care your mother specifically tried to prevent. Michael's jaw tightened. Dad, you can't live alone forever. Yesterday's incident with Rebecca proved that. You're becoming irrational, confrontational, potentially unsafe. The best thing for everyone would be professional care in a supervised environment. There it was. The truth beneath all the legal maneuvering. This wasn't about protecting the family from manipulation. This was about getting rid of the inconvenient old man who'd become too difficult to manage. So you'd destroy your dying mother's wishes, I said slowly. Invalidate the will she spent months carefully crafting, and warehouse me in some facility where I can't cause any more trouble. I'd protect this family from being torn apart by impossible conditions and emotional blackmail. I looked at the papers spread across my table, at the clinical language used to describe Margaret's love as manipulation, at the legal precedents my son planned to use to destroy his mother's final gift to me. Then I started laughing. It started as a chuckle and grew into something deeper, something that came from a place of absolute clarity. Michael looked at me like I'd lost my mind, which only made me laugh harder. Dad, what's so funny? You, I said, wiping tears from my eyes. You're so focused on finding a legal solution that you've completely missed the obvious problem. What problem? I gathered up his papers and handed them back to him. You can't contest a will you haven't inherited under yet. Michael blinked. What do you mean? I mean the will hasn't been probated yet. I'm still alive, son. The inheritance conditions haven't triggered because there's nothing to inherit. All you've done is show me a very expensive legal strategy for attacking a document that isn't even active yet. The color drained from Michael's face as he realized his mistake. In his eagerness to find a legal solution, he'd forgotten the most basic fact: Margaret's will only mattered after I died. Until then, everything belonged to me, and I could do whatever I wanted with it. But the conditions, he started. The conditions are Margaret's way of telling you what has to happen for you to inherit anything when I'm gone. But I'm not gone, Michael. I'm right here, watching my youngest son try to invalidate his dying mother's wishes before they even take effect. I walked to my desk and pulled out a different document, one I'd had my own lawyer prepare the day after Margaret died. While you were researching ways to destroy your mother's will, I was making some legal preparations of my own. Michael took the document with shaking hands. It was a simple one-page form, officially witnessed and notarized. A revocation of beneficiaries on all my accounts, all my policies, all my assets. As of yesterday, I said calmly, you're not in my will anymore. None of you are. Everything goes to charity when I die. The hospice center where your mother spent her final days, specifically. You can't do that, Michael whispered. Actually, I can. I just did. See, here's the thing about being a lawyer, son. Sometimes you get so caught up in the technicalities that you forget about the fundamentals. And the fundamental truth is that this is my money, my house, my decision. Your mother's will gave you a chance to earn your inheritance. Your legal research just convinced me you don't deserve it. Michael stood there holding the document, his briefcase of legal strategies suddenly worthless. All his research, all his planning, all his clever arguments about diminished capacity and emotional coercion had backfired completely. Dad, please, he said, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he sounded like my son instead of my attorney. I was just trying to help. Help who, Michael? Help me? Or help yourself to money you haven't earned and don't deserve? The silence that followed was complete. Michael stood in my living room, surrounded by his legal papers, facing the complete destruction of everything he thought he could control. I can change this, I continued, tapping the revocation document. I can restore your inheritance any time I want. But not because you've found some legal loophole or technicality. Only if you earn it back the way your mother intended, by proving that you can love me more than you love my money. Michael's hands were shaking as he put his papers back in his briefcase. How do I do that? The same way your brother is trying to do it. By spending time with me. By getting to know me again. By treating me like a father instead of a legal obstacle. He snapped his briefcase shut, but made no move toward the door. What if I can't? What if too much has changed? It was the most honest question he'd asked all evening. The most human moment we'd shared in years. Then at least we'll both know where we stand, I said. But Michael, I need you to understand something. Your mother didn't create those conditions to punish you. She created them because she remembered what you were like before you became someone who could stand in his dying mother's living room and call her love manipulation. He looked up at me, and for just a moment I saw the little boy who used to follow me around the garage, handing me tools and asking endless questions about how everything worked. I miss her, he said quietly. I miss Mom so much it feels like I can't breathe sometimes. So do I replied. Every single day. Is that why you're doing this? Because you miss her? I shook my head. I'm doing this because she was right. Because somewhere along the way, we all forgot how to be a family. And maybe, just maybe, it's not too late to remember. Michael walked to the door, then stopped. Same deal as David? 2 visits a week, meaningful contact? Same deal. But Michael? Leave the briefcase at home next time. Come as my son, not as my lawyer. After he left, I sat alone with the revocation document, thinking about how easy it had been to erase my children's inheritance with a single signature. How simple it would be to make them all disappear from my life forever. But I didn't want to erase them. Despite everything, despite Rebecca's cruelty, despite David's obligation-driven lunch date, despite Michael's legal maneuvering, I didn't want to lose my children. I wanted to save them. The question was whether they wanted to be saved. My phone rang at 10:30. Rebecca's name on the caller ID. Hi, sweetheart. Dad? Her voice was small, uncertain. Can I come over tomorrow? I need to talk to you about something. Of course. What time works for you? After work? Around 6? I'll make dinner, I said. Your favorite. Pot roast with those carrots you used to pick out when you were little. She laughed, and it sounded almost like the daughter I remembered. You remember that I pick out carrots? I remember everything about you, Rebecca. Everything. After she hung up, I realized something had fundamentally changed. For the first time since Margaret's death, my children were calling me. Not because they felt obligated, not because it was a holiday or birthday, but because they needed something from me that wasn't money. They needed to know if their father still loved them despite what they'd become. The answer was yes. But they were going to have to earn the right to hear it. Rebecca arrived the next evening carrying a bottle of wine and an expression I hadn't seen since she was 16 and had crashed my car into a neighbor's mailbox. It was the face of someone who had something difficult to confess and wasn't sure how it would be received. She stood on my front porch for nearly a minute before finally knocking, and when I opened the door, her eyes were already bright with unshed tears. Hi, Dad, she said softly. If you've ever been in a situation where someone who hurt you badly comes back asking for forgiveness, you know that moment of choice I was facing. You can hold on to your anger and make them pay, or you can be bigger than your hurt and see what they're really trying to say. What happened in my kitchen that night changed everything between us, but not in the way either of us expected. The pot roast was perfect, Margaret's recipe executed exactly the way she taught me during 37 years of marriage. Rebecca set the table without being asked, using the everyday dishes instead of the good china, which felt like a small act of humility. We ate mostly in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us like fog. This tastes exactly like Mom's, she said finally, cutting her carrots into tiny pieces the way she'd done as a child. I had a good teacher, I replied. Your mother made this same meal every Sunday for 15 years. I watched her make it probably 800 times. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. I miss Sunday dinners. So do I. The simple exchange seemed to break something open between us. Rebecca set down her fork and looked at me across the small table where she'd eaten thousands of meals as a child. Dad, I need to tell you something. About why I said what I said yesterday. About why I've been. She searched for words that wouldn't come. About why I've been such a terrible daughter. I waited. One thing I'd learned in 63 years was that when someone is trying to confess something difficult, the best thing you can do is give them space to find their own words. 5 years ago, she began, Mark and I went through a really rough patch. Really rough. We almost got divorced. Mark was her husband of 18 years, a good man who'd always treated me with respect and genuine affection. I'd never suspected their marriage was in trouble. What happened? Rebecca's hands were shaking slightly as she reached for her wine glass. He had an affair. It lasted about 6 months before I found out. And when I confronted him, he said. She paused, taking a shaky breath. He said I was cold. That I didn't know how to love people anymore. That living with me was like living with someone who was just going through the motions of being a wife. The pain in her voice was raw, real. This wasn't manipulation or strategy. This was my daughter bleeding in front of me. He wasn't wrong, she continued. I mean, he was wrong to have an affair, but he wasn't wrong about me. I had become cold. I had stopped knowing how to love people. And when I tried to figure out when that happened, when I became someone who could make her husband feel so alone that he'd turn to another woman. She stopped, wiping her eyes with the napkin that had been folded beside her plate since childhood, the same way Margaret had taught her. When did it happen? I asked gently. When Mom got sick, she whispered. When I watched the strongest woman I'd ever known waste away to nothing. When I sat beside her hospital bed and listened to her tell me she was proud of me, even though I knew I didn't deserve it. When I realized that someday I was going to lose both my parents, and I couldn't handle that kind of pain. The confession hung between us like a physical thing. I could see the effort it was taking her to continue, the way she was forcing herself to look at truths she'd been avoiding for years. So I started pulling away, she said. From Mom, from you, from Mark, from the kids. I convinced myself that if I didn't get too attached, if I didn't need anyone too much, it wouldn't hurt so bad when they were gone. I turned into this efficient, practical person who could handle anything except actually feeling anything. She looked up at me, and I saw the little girl who used to curl up in my lap when thunderstorms scared her. And it worked, Dad. When Mom died, it didn't destroy me because I'd already cut myself off from loving her completely. But it didn't hurt less. It just hurt differently. Instead of grieving for someone I loved, I was grieving for someone I'd failed to love when I had the chance. The honesty of her words was breathtaking and heartbreaking at the same time. For 5 years, I'd watched my daughter become colder, more distant, more focused on practical matters than emotional ones. I'd assumed she was just busy, just overwhelmed with the demands of adult life. I'd never realized she was protecting herself from the pain of losing us. Is that why you wanted to put me in assisted living? I asked. To finish cutting yourself off from loving me? Rebecca nodded, tears streaming down her face. If you were somewhere safe, somewhere professional, I could tell myself I was being responsible instead of cruel. I could visit you once a month and feel like a dutiful daughter without risking actually caring enough to be hurt when you die. When you die, she confirmed. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her confession settling between us. Outside, the sun was setting, painting my kitchen in the golden light that Margaret had always loved. I could almost feel her presence, the way she'd listened to our conversations with our children, always ready to offer comfort or guidance when it was needed. Rebecca, I said finally, do you remember what you used to do when you were little and thought you'd done something terrible? She smiled through her tears. I'd hide under the kitchen table and wait for you to find me. And what would I say when I found you? You'd say, come out, sweetheart. Whatever it is, we can fix it together. Can we fix this together? Rebecca looked around the kitchen, at the photos on the refrigerator, at the worn spot on the floor where Margaret used to stand while cooking, at the window over the sink where she'd watched her children play in the backyard. When she looked back at me, something had shifted in her expression. I don't know if I remember how to love people without being terrified of losing them, she said. That's okay, I replied. Being terrified just means it matters. The trick is learning to love people because you might lose them, not in spite of it. Is that what you're doing with us? With the will conditions and everything? I considered the question carefully. Your mother and I spent 35 years loving you kids without any guarantee that you'd love us back. We did it because that's what parents do. We love you not because we have to, but because we choose to, every single day. The will conditions aren't about making you love me. They're about giving you the chance to choose to love me, the same way I chose to love you. Rebecca pushed her plate away and leaned back in her chair. Mark and I worked it out, eventually. We went to counseling, did the hard work of rebuilding trust. But it took him threatening to leave for me to realize that my fear of being hurt was hurting everyone around me. And now? Now I'm trying to learn how to be someone worth loving again. It's harder than I thought it would be. Turns out when you spend 5 years building walls, tearing them down is exhausting. I reached across the table and took her hand. It was smaller than I remembered, softer than mine, but marked with the same small scars that came from a lifetime of taking care of other people. You were always worth loving, sweetheart. Always. Even when you were trying your hardest to convince everyone otherwise. She squeezed my hand, holding on like she was afraid I might disappear. I'm sorry, Dad. For what I said yesterday, for the way I've been treating you, for wasting so much time being afraid instead of grateful. I forgive you, I said simply. But Rebecca, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this, the will conditions, the family meetings, any of it, to punish you for pulling away. I'm doing it because I believe you're still in there somewhere. The little girl who used to help me in the garden, who used to fall asleep on my lap during movies, who used to think her dad was the strongest, smartest, most wonderful man in the world. What if she's gone? Rebecca whispered. What if I waited too long and she's just gone? Then we'll figure out who you are now, I said. And maybe, if we're both brave enough, we'll discover that the woman you've become is someone worth loving too. Rebecca stayed until almost 10 o'clock that night, washing dishes beside me the way she had as a teenager, telling me about her children's school activities and Mark's new job and the book club she joined but never had time to read the books for. Small talk, mostly, but it felt different than our conversations had in years. It felt like she was actually there, present in the moment instead of mentally planning her escape. As she was leaving, she paused at the front door. Dad? Can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you think Mom would be proud of me? If she could see me now, trying to fix what I broke, would she think I was worth the trouble she went to with that will? I thought about Margaret's final weeks, about the conversations we'd had about our children and the people they'd become. About her fears for their futures and her love for who they used to be. Your mother's last words to me, I said, were about you kids. She said, they're still in there, Thomas. Our babies are still in there, underneath all the fear and the busyness and the walls they've built. Promise me you won't give up on them. So to answer your question, yes, Rebecca. She'd be proud of you for having the courage to tear down those walls. Rebecca hugged me then, really hugged me, for the first time in years. Not the polite, perfunctory embrace of obligated family visits, but the desperate, clinging hug of a daughter who'd almost lost her father and was just beginning to realize it. I love you, Dad, she whispered against my shoulder. I love you too, sweetheart, I replied. I never stopped. After she left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the comfortable silence of a house that had seen its share of confessions and reconciliations. But something was nagging at me, a detail from Rebecca's story that didn't quite fit. She'd said her marriage trouble started 5 years ago, when Margaret got sick. But Margaret had only been diagnosed 3 years ago. The timeline was wrong, and in my experience, when someone's timeline was wrong during an emotional confession, it usually meant there was more to the story. I made a mental note to ask her about it later. Because if I'd learned anything from Margaret's careful planning, it was that the details mattered. And sometimes the details people got wrong were more important than the ones they got right. The phone rang at 11:15 p.m. David's name on the caller ID. Hi, son. Dad, His voice was tight with something I couldn't identify. I just talked to Rebecca. She told me about dinner tonight, about what you two discussed. And I need to tell you something too. Something I should have said a long time ago. I settled into my chair, recognizing the tone in his voice. It was the same one Rebecca had used, the sound of someone preparing to bleed in front of another person. I'm listening, I said. It's about why I've been so distant. Why visits became obligations and phone calls became chores. It's not because I don't love you, Dad. It's because I love you too much. I frowned. I don't understand. David was quiet for so long I thought he might have hung up. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion I'd rarely heard from him. Do you remember when I was 8 and broke my arm falling off my bike? Of course. You cried more about the bike being scratched than the broken bone. Do you remember what you did while we waited in the emergency room? I thought back to that day, trying to recall details that were 37 years old. I told you stories. Made up adventures about a boy with a magic cast who could do anything. For 4 hours, David said. While Mom filled out paperwork and dealt with insurance and doctors, you sat beside my hospital bed for 4 hours making up stories to keep me from being scared. You missed work, missed sleep, missed everything else in your life because I needed you. You were my son. Of course I stayed with you. That's exactly my point. David's voice cracked. You were always there, Dad. Every soccer game, every school play, every stupid award ceremony. You worked double shifts to pay for things we wanted, took extra jobs to afford family vacations, sacrificed your own dreams so we could chase ours. You gave us everything you had. I was beginning to understand where this was going, and it was breaking my heart. And when I became an adult, David continued, when I had my own career and family and responsibilities, I realized something that terrified me. I realized I wasn't like you. I wasn't the kind of man who could put everyone else first for 40 years. I wasn't selfless enough, strong enough, good enough to be the kind of father you were. The silence that followed was filled with 30 years of misunderstood distance. So I pulled away, he said finally. Not because I didn't love you, but because every time I saw you, I was reminded of how much better a man you were than I could ever be. Every visit, every phone call, every family dinner was a reminder that I was failing to live up to the standard you'd set. David, I said softly, I never wanted you to live up to any standard. I know that now, he interrupted. But at the time, all I could see was this man who'd given everything for his family, and I knew I wasn't capable of that kind of sacrifice. So it felt easier to stay away, to limit contact, to keep our relationship at arm's length where I couldn't disappoint you by being less than you deserved. I sat in the darkness of my living room, processing this revelation. For years I'd thought my children were pulling away because they didn't need me anymore. I'd never considered that they might be pulling away because they thought they weren't worthy of me. Son, I said carefully, do you think I spent 40 years being a good father because it was easy for me? Wasn't it? I laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. David, being a parent scared me to death every single day. I had no idea what I was doing. I made it up as I went along, hoped for the best, and prayed I wouldn't screw you kids up too badly. But you always seemed so confident, so sure of yourself. That's because I couldn't let you see how terrified I was. I couldn't let you know that most of the time, I felt like I was failing at the most important job I'd ever have. The confidence was an act, son. A performance designed to make you feel safe and loved. David was quiet again, processing this information. I worked those double shifts not because I was some noble, selfless hero, I continued, but because the alternative was failing to provide for my children, and that was unacceptable to me. I went to your soccer games not because I was Father of the Year, but because missing them would have meant missing the chance to see you happy, and your happiness was more important to me than my tiredness. But you made it look so easy. Because that was my job. Making the hard things look easy so you kids could just be kids. But David, I never expected you to be exactly like me. I expected you to be exactly like you, only better. And from where I'm sitting, you succeeded. How can you say that? His voice was filled with anguish. I've been a terrible son. I've ignored you, avoided you, treated you like an obligation. And you've also built a successful career, raised 2 beautiful children, been a faithful husband, and become the kind of man who calls his father at 11 p.m. to have an honest conversation about love and fear and regret. That sounds like success to me. The silence that followed felt different. Less heavy somehow. Like something that had been twisted was slowly straightening itself out. Dad? David's voice was small, uncertain. Is it too late? To be the kind of son you deserve? You already are the kind of son I deserve, I said. The question is whether it's too late for you to believe it. We talked for another hour that night, about mistakes and misunderstandings, about love that had been hidden behind walls of inadequacy and fear. When we finally hung up, I realized that Margaret's plan was working in ways she might never have anticipated. She hadn't just created conditions for inheritance. She'd created conditions for truth. For the kind of honest conversations that families usually only have in crisis moments, or deathbed confessions. She'd forced us all to examine not just what we owed each other, but what we meant to each other. But there was still something nagging at me about Rebecca's story. Something about the timeline that didn't add up. And if there was one thing I'd learned in 40 years of raising children, it was that when the timeline didn't add up, there was usually a secret hiding in the gaps. A secret that could change everything. 3 weeks into our new arrangement, I was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, Margaret's plan was working. David had kept his promise about lunch dates, even bringing his kids along twice so I could actually have conversations with grandchildren who'd grown into strangers. Michael had surprised me by showing up with takeout Chinese food and spending an entire evening helping me organize Margaret's old photos, sharing memories I'd forgotten he even had. Rebecca had called every other day, sometimes just to chat about nothing important, which felt like everything important. But families built on secrets never stay repaired for long. And the secret Rebecca had been hiding was about to tear apart everything we'd worked to rebuild. If you've ever discovered that someone you love has been lying to you about something fundamental, something that changes not just what you think about them, but what you think about yourself, then you know the feeling I'm about to describe. It's like finding out the ground you've been standing on was never solid to begin with. And sometimes, that discovery comes from the most unexpected places. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was watering Margaret's roses. Judge Morrison's name appeared on my phone screen, which immediately set off alarm bells in my head. As the trustee of Margaret's will, he only contacted me when there were official matters to discuss. Thomas. His voice was carefully neutral, which was never a good sign with judges. I need to see you this afternoon. There's been a development regarding the will that requires immediate attention. What kind of development? The kind that needs to be discussed in person. Can you be at my office at 2 o'clock? Judge Morrison's office hadn't changed in the 20 years I'd known him. Same mahogany desk, same law books lining the walls, same American flag in the corner that had been there since his swearing-in ceremony. But his expression was troubled in a way I'd never seen before. Thomas, sit down, he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear. I sat down slowly, my mind racing through possibilities. Had one of my children tried to contest the will after all? Had Michael found some legal loophole I didn't know about? It's about Rebecca, Judge Morrison said carefully. About her compliance with the will conditions. What about it? She's been calling, visiting, having real conversations with me for the first time in years. If anything, she's exceeding the requirements. Judge Morrison opened a file folder and pulled out a photograph. He slid it across the desk to me, and my world tilted off its axis. It was a surveillance photo, black and white, grainy but clear enough. Rebecca sitting in what looked like a lawyer's office, papers spread across a conference table, shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit. This was taken 6 days ago, Judge Morrison said gently. At the offices of Keller, Brooks and Associates. They specialize in estate litigation. I stared at the photo, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Rebecca's consulting with estate lawyers? She's not just consulting with them, Thomas. She's retained them. They've filed a preliminary motion to have Margaret's will declared invalid based on diminished capacity and undue influence. The words hit me like physical blows. While Rebecca had been sitting in my kitchen, crying about her marriage and her fear of losing people, while she'd been hugging me and telling me she loved me, she'd been plotting to destroy her mother's will. That's impossible, I said weakly. She wouldn't, after everything we talked about. Judge Morrison pulled out another document. The motion was filed yesterday. It alleges that Margaret was not of sound mind when she added the conditional clauses, that she was unduly influenced by you, and that the requirements constitute emotional coercion. I recognized the language. It was exactly what Michael had proposed 3 weeks ago, almost word for word. Which meant, Michael's involved in this too, I said. Judge Morrison nodded grimly. All 3 of your children are listed as petitioners. Rebecca hired the lawyers, Michael provided the legal research, and David is financing the litigation. The betrayal was so complete, so carefully orchestrated, that I almost had to admire the planning that had gone into it. While I'd been believing that we were rebuilding our relationships, they'd been building a case to destroy their mother's will. Every visit, every phone call, every moment of apparent reconciliation had been a performance designed to keep me distracted while they worked to invalidate the conditions that protected me. There's more, Judge Morrison said quietly. The motion includes a request for emergency guardianship. What does that mean? It means they're asking the court to declare you mentally incompetent to manage your own affairs. If successful, they'd be appointed as your legal guardians with the authority to make all decisions about your care, your living arrangements, and your assets. The room seemed to spin around me. This wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. This was about taking away my freedom, my autonomy, my right to make my own choices about my life. This was exactly what Margaret had feared would happen, only worse. On what grounds? I asked. Judge Morrison consulted the file. They claim you've been exhibiting signs of paranoid delusion, emotional instability, and impaired judgment. They cite your irrational interpretation of Margaret's will, your manipulative behavior regarding the inheritance conditions, and your inability to recognize your need for professional care. Each accusation was like a knife twist. Every honest conversation I'd had with my children, every moment of vulnerability I'd shared, every attempt to rebuild our relationship had been catalogued and weaponized against me. They've also provided statements from neighbors, Judge Morrison continued, claiming you've been acting erratically, forgetting things, appearing confused and disoriented. That's not true, I said. I've never. I know it's not true, Thomas. I've known you for 30 years, and you're as sharp as you've ever been. But that doesn't matter if they can convince a judge otherwise. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what my children had done. They hadn't just betrayed me, they betrayed their mother's memory, her final wishes, everything she tried to protect me from. How long do I have? I asked. The hearing is scheduled for next Friday. 1 week from today. If you're going to fight this, you need to start immediately. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 63 years in my joints and bones. Judge Morrison, can I ask you something? Of course. In your professional opinion, do they have a case? He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. They have expensive lawyers, carefully prepared documentation, and a compelling narrative about a grieving widower who's lost touch with reality. In family court, especially when it comes to elderly guardianship cases, that can be enough. Even though it's not true? The truth and what can be proven in court are sometimes 2 different things, Thomas. I'm sorry. I drove home in a daze, the surveillance photos and legal documents on the passenger seat beside me like evidence of a crime I'd never seen coming. My children hadn't just been planning to contest the will, they'd been building a case to have me declared incompetent, to take away my freedom, to warehouse me in some facility where I couldn't interfere with their plans. And the most devastating part was how perfectly they'd played me. Every tear Rebecca had shed, every honest conversation David had initiated, Every memory Michael had shared, it had all been theater. They'd studied their marks, learned exactly what I wanted to hear, and delivered it with the precision of professional con artists. When I got home, there was a message on my answering machine. Rebecca's voice, bright and cheerful. "Hi, Dad. Just calling to check on you. I was thinking about making that pot roast again this weekend if you'd like me to come over. Call me back." I played the message 3 times, listening for any hint of deception, any crack in the performance. But her voice sounded exactly like it had that night when she'd confessed her fears about loving people, genuine, vulnerable, heartbroken. Either she was the most talented actress I'd ever met or... The thought hit me like a lightning bolt. What if Rebecca didn't know about the legal action? What if Michael and David had filed the motion without telling her? What if she really had been trying to rebuild our relationship, while her brothers were plotting to destroy it? I picked up the phone and dialed her number. She answered on the second ring. "Hi, Dad. Rebecca," I said carefully. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. What's wrong? You sound upset. Have you spoken to any lawyers recently? About your mother's will or about me?" The silence that followed was answer enough. It stretched for 10, 15, 20 seconds before she finally spoke. "Dad, I can explain." "So you have." "Yes, but it's not what you think." "What I think," I interrupted, "is that while you were sitting in my kitchen crying about learning to love people again, you were plotting to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could steal your mother's inheritance." "That's not true." Her voice was desperate, panicked. "Dad, please, you have to listen to me." "Why should I listen to you, Rebecca? Why should I believe anything you say when you've been lying to me for weeks?" "Because I wasn't lying," she shouted. "Everything I told you that night was true. My marriage, my fears, my regrets, all of it was true. The only thing I lied about was when it started." Something in her voice made me pause. "What do you mean?" "The problems with Mark, the pulling away from the family, it didn't start when Mom got sick. It started 7 years ago, when I found out something that changed everything I thought I knew about our family." My blood went cold. "What did you find out?" "Dad," Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper, "I know about Sarah." The name hit me like a physical blow. Sarah. The name I'd buried so deep in my past that I'd almost convinced myself it had never happened. The secret that Margaret and I had agreed to take to our graves. The mistake that had nearly destroyed our marriage 30 years ago. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, but the words sounded hollow even to me. "Yes, you do," Rebecca said. "I know about the affair, Dad. I know about the woman you were seeing while Mom was pregnant with Michael. I know about the daughter you have with her. I know about the child support you've been paying for 37 years. The phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the kitchen floor. I stood there in the silence of my empty house, surrounded by photos of the family I thought I'd protected, staring at the wreckage of secrets that were never supposed to see the light of day. Rebecca was still talking, her voice tiny and distant coming from the phone on the floor. But I couldn't hear her words over the sound of my own world collapsing. Because she was right. About all of it. And now everything, the will, the inheritance, the careful rebuilding of our relationships, was about to be destroyed by a truth I'd spent 4 decades trying to hide. I picked up the phone with shaking hands, Rebecca's voice still pouring out of it like blood from an open wound. "And I've known for 7 years, Dad. 7 years of watching you and Mom pretend that everything was perfect, that our family was built on love and sacrifice and honesty, when the whole time there was this huge lie at the center of everything." "Rebecca, stop." The words came out harder than I intended, but I needed her to stop talking, needed a moment to think, to figure out how to handle the detonation of a secret that was supposed to stay buried forever. If you've ever had your deepest, most shameful secret exposed by the people you love most, you know the feeling I'm describing. It's not just embarrassment or guilt, it's the complete annihilation of the person you thought you were, replaced by the person you actually are. And sometimes, that person is someone you don't recognize at all. "How did you find out?" I asked quietly. Rebecca's voice was thick with tears. I was helping Mom organize papers for your insurance renewal. She asked me to get some documents from your desk drawer, and I found the bank statements. Monthly payments to someone named Sarah Chin for 37 years. Always the same amount, always on the same date. It took me about 5 minutes to put it together. Sarah Chin. Even hearing her name spoken aloud after all these years was like a punch to the gut. Sarah, who had been my secretary at the construction company where I worked when Rebecca was a baby and David was starting school. Sarah, who had listened to me complain about sleepless nights and financial stress and the overwhelming pressure of providing for a growing family. Sarah, who had offered comfort that became something more, something that lasted 6 months and produced a daughter I'd never been allowed to acknowledge. Did your mother know that you knew? I asked. Are you kidding me? Rebecca's laugh was bitter, harsh. That's the first question you ask? Not I'm sorry or I can explain, but whether Mom knew her secret was out? She was right, and her anger was justified. But I was drowning in the implications of what she'd discovered, trying to calculate how much damage had already been done, and how much more was coming. Your mother and I worked through what happened with Sarah, I said finally. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake that nearly destroyed our marriage. But we survived it, Rebecca. We chose to stay together, to rebuild what we'd broken, to make our family stronger than it was before. By lying to us for 40 years. By protecting you from something that would have served no purpose except to hurt you. We were shouting at each other now, 30 years of buried resentment and hidden truth exploding between us like a dam break. You have another daughter, Dad. I have a half-sister I've never met. David and Michael have a sibling they don't even know exists. How is that protecting us? The pain in her voice was devastating, but it was nothing compared to the pain that was coming when she learned the whole truth. Because what Rebecca had discovered was only half the story. The easy half. What's her name? Rebecca asked when I didn't respond. Your other daughter. What's her name? Jenny, I whispered. Her name is Jenny. Jenny what? I closed my eyes, knowing that what I said next would change everything beyond repair. Jenny Morrison. The silence that followed was complete. I could hear Rebecca's breathing on the other end of the line, could practically hear her mind working through the implications. Morrison, she repeated slowly. As in Judge Morrison? As in the trustee of Mom's will? Yes. Oh my God! Her voice was barely audible. Oh my God, Dad! You didn't just have an affair. You had an affair with Judge Morrison's wife. Ex-wife, I corrected weakly. They were already separated when when it happened. Does he know? Rebecca's voice was getting higher, more panicked. Does Judge Morrison know that you're Jenny's father? This was the part I'd dreaded for 37 years, the secret that could destroy not just my family but everything Margaret and I had built together. He's always known, I said. Sarah told him when she found out she was pregnant. He could have divorced her, could have made a scene, could have destroyed my marriage and my career. Instead, he chose to raise Jenny as his own daughter. Legally, officially, completely. She carries his name, considers him her father, has no idea that I'm anything more to her than her father's old friend. Rebecca was crying now, deep, wrenching sobs that tore at my heart. That's why you chose him as the trustee. That's why Mom trusted him with the will. Because he's been keeping your secret for 40 years. Your mother chose him because he was the most honest, trustworthy man we knew. A man who had every reason to hate me but chose forgiveness instead. A man who understood what it meant to put family before personal feelings. And Jenny? What about Jenny? Does she know? I thought about Judge Morrison's daughter, the brilliant young woman who'd followed in her father's footsteps and become a family court attorney. Jenny, who was 36 years old and had her mother's eyes but my stubborn chin. Jenny, who had grown up calling me Uncle Thomas at family gatherings, never knowing that half her DNA came from the man she thought was just her father's old friend. She doesn't know, I said. And she never can know. It would destroy her relationship with the man who raised her, the man she loves as her father. It would serve no purpose except to cause pain. Rebecca was quiet for a long time, processing this information. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder, colder. "So let me make sure I understand this," she said. "You had an affair 37 years ago that produced a daughter you've never acknowledged. You've been paying child support in secret for 4 decades. Mom knew about it, forgave you for it, and helped you keep it hidden. Judge Morrison knows about it, has been raising your biological daughter as his own, and is now the trustee of Mom's will. And you think this is all perfectly fine because it happened a long time ago, and everyone involved decided to pretend it never happened. It's more complicated than that. No, Dad. It's exactly that simple. You built our entire family on a lie. And now you're shocked that we're not the perfect, grateful children you expected us to be." The accusation hit me like a physical blow because it contained just enough truth to be devastating. Had my guilt over Sarah influenced the way I'd raised my children? Had I overcompensated for my betrayal by being the perfect father, the sacrificing provider, the man who put his family first in everything? Had my children grown up sensing the falseness at the center of our family without understanding what it was? "Rebecca," I said carefully, "what happened with Sarah was wrong. But it doesn't change 40 years of love, of sacrifice, of building a life together as a family. Doesn't it?" Her voice was cold, analytical. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like everything you did, all those double shifts, all those sacrifices, all that perfect father behavior, was just guilt. You weren't being a good father because you loved us. You were being a good father because you felt bad about cheating on our mother." The words were like knives, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. Because there was truth in them, even if it wasn't the whole truth. My guilt over Sarah had influenced my parenting, had driven me to be better than I might have been otherwise. But it hadn't been the only motivation. It hadn't even been the primary one. "You're wrong," I said. "I was a good father because I loved you. All of you. More than my own life. Then why didn't you trust us with the truth?" It was the right question, and I didn't have a good answer for it. At least, not one that would satisfy a daughter who'd spent 7 years nursing anger over a secret she was never supposed to know. "Because some truths serve no purpose except to cause pain," I said finally. "Because protecting your children sometimes means protecting them from things they don't need to carry. That wasn't your choice to make. It was exactly my choice to make. I'm your father. Making hard choices to protect you has been my job for 42 years. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. This wasn't confusion or shock. This was the sound of a relationship breaking, possibly beyond repair. "Rebecca," I said gently, "why are you telling me this now? Why bring up something that happened before you were born?" "Because," she said, her voice steady and cold, "I need you to understand that I know exactly who you are. Not the perfect father you pretend to be, not the victim of ungrateful children that you've convinced yourself you are, but the man who built his family on lies and manipulation. And the guardianship petition? The lawyers? Are my way of making sure that you can't manipulate anyone ever again. The court needs to know about Sarah, about the secret payments, about the web of lies you've been maintaining for 40 years. They need to know that your interpretation of Mom's will is just another manipulation, another way to control people through guilt and obligation." I felt something inside me break completely. Not just my heart, but something deeper, the fundamental belief that family meant something, that love could survive betrayal, that forgiveness was possible between people who shared blood and history. "So this is your revenge," I said quietly. "For the sin of protecting you from a painful truth." "This is justice," Rebecca corrected. "For a lifetime of lies." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me alone in my kitchen with the wreckage of everything I'd thought I understood about my family. Outside, Margaret's roses were blooming in the late afternoon sun, beautiful and oblivious to the destruction happening inside the house she'd loved. I walked to her desk and pulled out the document I'd hoped never to use, the nuclear option Margaret, and I had discussed but prayed would never be necessary. If my children wanted to play hardball, if they wanted to destroy everything their mother had built to protect me, then they were about to learn that I had weapons too. Weapons that would change their lives forever. And not in ways they could ever see coming. I sat at Margaret's desk until the sun set completely, staring at the document that would either save me or destroy what was left of my family forever. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its evening routine, porch lights flickering on, families gathering around dinner tables, children being called in from their last moments of outdoor play. Normal families living normal lives, blissfully unaware that 3 houses down, an old man was preparing to detonate a bomb that would reshape 4 lives forever. The document in my hands was Margaret's final gift to me, and her final punishment for our children. She'd prepared it during her last weeks, when the cancer had made sleep impossible, and she'd spent long nights thinking about justice, protection, and the price of unconditional love. I'd argued against it then, believing it was too harsh, too final. Now, facing the complete betrayal of everything we'd tried to build, I understood her wisdom. If you've ever been pushed so far beyond your limits that you stop caring about the consequences of your actions, you know the dangerous clarity I felt in that moment. When you have nothing left to lose, you become capable of things you never thought possible. And what I was about to do would prove that even a cornered old man could be more dangerous than 3 successful adults who thought they held all the cards. My phone had been ringing all evening. David, Michael, even Rebecca calling back, probably coordinating their story, making sure their lies aligned before the court hearing. I let every call go to voicemail, listening to their increasingly desperate messages. Dad, please pick up. We need to talk about this rationally. That was David, still believing this was a business negotiation. Thomas, I know you're angry, but we can work this out. Michael, using his lawyer voice like it might still have power over me. Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't mean. Please call me back. Rebecca, realizing too late that she'd overplayed her hand. But the most important call came at 9:47 p.m. Judge Morrison's name on the caller ID. Hello, James, I said, using his first name for the first time in 30 years. Thomas. His voice was careful, measured. I think we need to talk. I imagine we do. Your office tomorrow morning? This conversation needs to happen somewhere more private. My house, 8 a.m. Come alone. The line went dead, and I realized that the reckoning I'd been avoiding for nearly 4 decades was finally here. Everything was about to come out, not just Sarah, not just Jenny, but all of it. Every buried secret, every careful lie, every compromise we'd made to keep our families intact. Judge Morrison lived in the same house he'd shared with Sarah 40 years ago, a modest 2-story colonial that had witnessed the rise and fall of more secrets than most churches. I'd been there countless times over the years, neighborhood barbecues, birthday parties, holiday gatherings where I'd played the role of family friend while looking into the eyes of the daughter I'd never been allowed to claim. He opened the door before I could knock, looking older than his 68 years. The stress of keeping our secret, of navigating the complex web of relationships and loyalties it had created, had taken its toll on both of us. Coffee? He asked, leading me to the same kitchen where Sarah used to make breakfast for the family that included my biological child. Please. We sat across from each other at the worn wooden table where I'd shared dozens of meals, always careful never to stare too long at Jenny, never to ask too many questions about her life, never to reveal the connection that bound me to her more tightly than friendship ever could. She called me last night, James said quietly. Rebecca. Told me everything she knows, everything she plans to reveal in court. How much is everything? Enough to destroy all of us. He set his coffee cup down with hands that weren't quite steady. The affair, the child support, Jenny's parentage. She has bank records, dates, documentation going back decades. I nodded, having expected this. Rebecca was thorough, just like her mother. When she decided to destroy someone, she made sure the job was complete. There's something else, James continued. Something she doesn't know yet, but will figure out soon enough. What? Jenny's been having health problems. Genetic issues that the doctors can't explain based on Sarah's family history and mine. They've been pushing for more detailed family medical information, suggesting genetic counseling, DNA testing. My blood went cold. How long before? Before she realizes that her medical history doesn't match her supposed parentage? Weeks, maybe days. The doctors are already asking questions that Sarah can't answer. We sat in silence, both of us understanding that the careful structure we'd built to protect everyone was collapsing faster than we could shore it up. Jenny was going to learn the truth whether we wanted her to or not. The only question was whether she'd learn it from us or from a courtroom drama orchestrated by my vindictive daughter. "There's something else, Thomas," James said, pulling out a manila envelope. "Something Margaret asked me to give you if this day ever came." I took the envelope with trembling hands. My name was written on the front in Margaret's careful handwriting, along with a date from 6 months before she died. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small key. The letter was brief, written in the shaky handwriting of someone fighting both cancer and powerful medications. "My dearest Thomas, if you're reading this, then our children have forced your hand and mine. I'm sorry it came to this, but I'm not surprised. I always knew that love built on sacrifice could turn to resentment if the sacrifice wasn't appreciated. The key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Box 847. Inside you'll find documents that will end this fight permanently. Use them only if you must, only if there's no other way to protect yourself from the people we raised to be better than this. I love you. I always have, even knowing about Sarah, even knowing about Jenny, even knowing that some part of your heart belonged to someone else for those 6 months. Love means choosing someone despite their flaws, not because they don't have any. Protect yourself, my darling. Our children have forgotten that you're worth protecting, but I never did. Forever yours, Margaret." I read the letter twice, my hands shaking harder with each word. Margaret had known. Not just about Sarah and the affair, she'd known about some final contingency, some last resort that I wasn't even aware existed. "Do you know what's in the safety deposit box?" I asked James. "I helped her gather some of the documents," he said quietly. "Thomas, what she collected, it changes everything. About the inheritance, about your children's futures, about the power dynamics in this family. Tell me." James stood up and walked to his kitchen window, looking out at the backyard where Jenny had played as a child, where I'd pushed her on swings and taught her to throw a baseball while pretending to be just a family friend. "Your children think they know the whole story," he said. "They think the affair with Sarah is your only secret, your only vulnerability. They have no idea what Margaret discovered in her final months." "What did she discover?" "That they've been lying too. All of them. For years." I felt the ground shift beneath me again. "What kind of lies?" James turned back to face me, his expression grim. "Rebecca's marriage problems didn't start when she found out about Sarah. They started when she had an affair of her own 3 years ago. With her boss. She embezzled money from her company to pay for hotel rooms and gifts. When she got caught, Mark had to liquidate his retirement account to pay restitution and avoid criminal charges." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Rebecca, who'd sat in my kitchen crying about her fears and failures, had been hiding her own betrayals. "David's insurance business is failing," James continued. "Has been for 2 years. He's been taking money from client accounts to cover operating expenses. It's sophisticated embezzlement, but it's still embezzlement. He needs money desperately, not for his family's comfort, but to avoid prison. And Michael? Michael's been billing clients for hours he never worked, charging for services he never provided. The State Bar Association is investigating him. He's looking at disbarment and possible criminal charges." I slumped back in my chair, the weight of these revelations crushing me. My 3 successful children, the adults I'd been so proud of, were all criminals. All of them desperate, all of them facing disgrace or prison, all of them needing my inheritance to save themselves from the consequences of their choices. "How did Margaret find out?" I asked. "She hired a private investigator after Rebecca found out about Sarah," James said. She wanted to know if there were other secrets in the family that might come out. She wanted to protect you from any more revelations. And instead she found out that our children were the ones with secrets. Worse than secrets. Crimes. Financial crimes that could send all of them to prison if the right people found out. I thought about the safety deposit box, about the key in my hand, about the documents that could end this fight permanently. Margaret had gathered evidence of my children's crimes, their lies, their desperate need for money. She'd given me the power to destroy them completely. What am I supposed to do with this? I asked. James sat back down across from me. That's up to you, Thomas. But the guardianship hearing is tomorrow. If they succeed in having you declared incompetent, they'll control your assets. They'll be able to contest Margaret's will from a position of legal authority. They'll get their inheritance no matter what the conditions were. Unless I use what Margaret gathered to stop them. Unless you show them that they're not the only ones with weapons. I stared at the key in my palm, this small piece of metal that represented absolute power over my children's futures. With the right documents, I could send all three of them to prison. I could destroy their careers, their reputations, their families. I could make them pay for every lie they told, every betrayal they'd planned, every moment of taking me for granted. Or I could choose to be better than they had been. James, I said finally, if I don't fight this, if I let them have me declared incompetent, what happens to Jenny when the truth comes out? She'll lose the only father she's ever known. She'll discover that her entire life was built on a lie. She'll have to choose between the man who raised her and the biological father who abandoned her. And if I do fight this? If I use Margaret's evidence to destroy my children? Then Jenny never has to know. The guardianship fails, your children's crimes get exposed, and the truth about her parentage stays buried in legal documents that no one will ever see. The choice was stark and terrible. I could save Jenny by destroying Rebecca, David, and Michael. Or I could save my children by destroying the family that had raised Jenny. I stood up, clutching the key so tightly it cut into my palm. I need to see what's in that box before I decide anything. Thomas, James called as I reached the door. Whatever you choose, remember that Margaret loved all of you. Even knowing what she knew, even gathering the evidence she gathered, she still loved your children. She just loved you more. I drove to the bank in the pre-dawn darkness, my mind racing through possibilities and consequences. The safety deposit box was in a secure room deep in the building's basement, accessible only with 2 keys and proper identification. Inside the box was a thick folder labeled, Insurance Policy, in Margaret's handwriting. But this wasn't life insurance or homeowners coverage. This was insurance against the family we'd raised becoming the people they'd apparently become. The documents were damning and thorough. Bank records showing Rebecca's embezzlement. Client files proving David's theft. Billing records documenting Michael's fraud. Margaret had even included photographs. Rebecca entering hotel rooms with her boss, David meeting with shady financial advisors, Michael at expensive restaurants while billing clients for time he was supposedly spending on their cases. At the bottom of the folder was a note in Margaret's handwriting. They made their choices, Thomas. Now you have to make yours. I sat in that windowless room for over an hour, holding the power to destroy my children in my hands. These weren't just embarrassing secrets, or minor indiscretions. These were federal crimes, career-ending scandals, family-destroying revelations. But they were also my children. The babies I'd rocked to sleep, the toddlers I'd taught to walk, the teenagers I'd guided through heartbreak and disappointment. Somewhere beneath the criminals and liars they'd become were the people Margaret and I had raised them to be. The question was, did those people still exist? My phone rang as I was putting the documents back in the folder. Rebecca's name on the caller ID. I answered on the 4th ring. Hello, Rebecca. Dad? Her voice was small, frightened. I need to tell you something. About the guardianship petition. I need you to know why I really filed it. I'm listening. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing you for the affair with Sarah. It was. She took a shaky breath. It was because I'm going to prison, Dad. They're going to arrest me, and I need money for lawyers, for restitution, for my kids' futures when their mother is behind bars. The confession hung between us like a bridge I could either cross or burn. I know, I said quietly. The silence that followed was complete. You know? She whispered. I know about all of it, Rebecca. Your embezzlement, David's theft, Michael's fraud. I know about the desperation that drove you to try to steal your mother's inheritance. How could you possibly? Because your mother knew too. She spent her final months gathering evidence of what you'd all become. She left me the power to destroy all of you if I chose to use it. Rebecca was crying now, deep, hopeless sobs. Are you going to use it? I looked down at the folder in my hands, at the evidence that could send my daughter to prison for a decade or more. At the documents that could save Jenny from learning a truth that would devastate her, but only by destroying the woman who was still, despite everything, my little girl. That depends, I said, on what you do in the next 24 hours. What do you mean? I closed the folder and stood up, decision made. Meet me at the house tonight, Rebecca. All three of you. 7 o'clock. It's time to finish this. Dad, what are you going to do? I'm going to give you one last chance to remember who you used to be before you became who you are. And then we're all going to live with the consequences of what you choose. I hung up before she could respond, then walked out of the bank into the morning sunlight. In 12 hours, my family would gather around Margaret's dining room table one last time. By the time we left that room, we'd either be a family again or we'd be strangers who happened to share DNA. But one way or another, the lies would finally be over. And the truth, whatever it cost all of us, would finally set us free. If this story has taught me anything in these past months since that final family meeting, and I hope it's taught you something too, it's that love isn't something you can inherit, or steal, or manipulate your way into receiving. Love is a choice you make every single day, with every word you speak and every action you take. My children chose fear over faith, greed over gratitude, manipulation over honesty. But in the end, I chose them anyway. Not because they deserved it, but because that's what parents do. We love our children not because they're perfect, but because they're ours. The truth did set us free that night, though not in the way any of us expected. Some bridges got burned. Some relationships couldn't be saved. But some things, the most important things, got rebuilt stronger than they'd ever been before. If you're dealing with family drama of your own, if you're struggling with people who take you for granted or treat your love like an obligation, remember this: you have more power than you think. You get to decide what you're worth. You get to set the conditions for how people treat you. And sometimes the people who claim to love you need to be reminded that love is a privilege, not a right. Drop a comment below and let me know, have you ever had to choose between protecting yourself and protecting people who'd betrayed you? What did you choose, and would you choose the same thing again? Hit that subscribe button if this story resonated with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they're worth more than they're being treated. And remember, it's never too late to demand the love and respect you deserve. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let people treat you as anything less than your worth. That's a lesson that took me 63 years to learn. I hope it doesn't take you that long. Until next time, this is Thomas Brennan, reminding you that family isn't just about blood, it's about choice. And everyone deserves to be chosen by the people they love.